Amanda here. Welcome back to my book nook. Today we're going to be doing a different sort of book that I haven't gone over yet, which means it's going to be another slightly different format. What we're going to be talking about today is a book that is written on an actual event that happened in history. It's a fully historical novel. Not historical fiction, an actual historical novel. So the way that I'm going to talk about it after I introduce the book and give a little bit more in depth of, yes, it's a historical novel, but what type of history are we going to be dealing with? So a little subcategory of history is I'm going to discuss the historical aspect of the actual history of the event, and then I'm going to talk about the writing of the story before the writing of the book before I give my rating. Today's book is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. So while I said this was a historical story, a historical novel, it is in a very specific type of genre. I'm sure many of you have heard before of dystopian fiction. It's a very common genre, especially for a while it was very common in your young adult series. You had Hunger Games, Divergent, and Maze Runner were all dystopian fiction. I had never heard the term that I phrased this as before I started using it, but I think it works best to describe the type of historical novel that we're talking about. This is dystopian nonfiction. So, the history. In the early 1900s, radium was found by Madame and Monsieur Curie. And even though the scientific community knew, hey, this substance isn't really the safest because people who were doing experimentation on it were getting sick, for the rest of the world and the general populace, it was seen almost as a miracle mineral. It was put in food, it was put in water, it would be put in toothpaste, and for what is pertinent to this story, it was put in paint. And said paint would glow in the dark. And it was used very commonly for things like watches. And in many other countries, these watches would be painted with a wooden or glass stylus. However, in the United States, in the two companies that we are going to be discussing, the United States Radium Corporation, which was in Orange, New Jersey, and normally when I speak about it from now on, I will just be using the abbreviation USRC, and Radium Dial in Ottawa, Illinois. USRC was formed 1910s-ish. The story where it picks up in here is 1917, so we're getting into World War I, but USRC had already been working before then, and Radium Dial opened in 1922. Both of these places, they used, instead of a stylus, camel hair fine point paintbrushes. And this is the first difference between the two. USRC, if the women and girls, and I will sometimes call them women, I'll sometimes call them girls. In this time frame, when I say women and girls, it is because of the fact that some of the women started working at these companies as young as 14, and the average age for starting work was between 16 and 21. So these were young women. And like I said, some of these were children. I'm sorry, 14 to 16-year-olds are definite children. They're girls. And so for these, at USRC, the women could do whatever they desired in order to keep the paintbrushes how they needed to be. But at Radium Dial, what I'm going to be talking about was a requirement of the job. The problem with a paintbrush is twofold. One, you must make sure that it stays moist because the paint will dry it out, and if you just wait a while, it will dry out on its own. And two, it was a fine tip paintbrush, and in order to paint the numbers on correctly, that tip must stay fine. So what the girls would do, I do not have a paintbrush, we're going to pretend like I do, is they would place the paintbrush in their mouth, spin it around, and pull it out so it was brought to a fine point and it was moistened. It would then be dipped in the radium paint and they would begin painting on their numbers. For some of the women, one of these lip pointings would last them for 3 or 4 numbers. For others, they were lucky if they were able to get a full number out of it. Before I continue, I'm also going to add in now our full content warnings. Because this was the part, hey, we don't need a lot of full content warnings yet. Major full content warning. As you can tell, there were some dangerous business practices. That's not really the content warning. The content warnings regards to the medical aspect. You have medical malpractice on behalf of companies, and we're going to have medical gore. I'm sorry. There is no way to talk about the history of this without talking on those 2 topics. The first women to get sick were the ones working at USRC because, again, it started before Radium Dial, and these women were getting sick even before Radium Dial opened. In fact, the first woman died prior to Radium Dial opening. So Radium Dial probably had gotten a little bit of knowledge of what was happening before opening. You know, it may have been talked about inside, you know, anyone who's working in the radium industry a little bit. And radium is attracted to calcium. It likes to bind to calcium. And for many of the women who got sick and died, the first person who realized something was wrong, other than them, because they would feel pain in their mouth, in their body, they were not feeling well. But the first person outside of them who would really know that something was wrong would be their dentist. Their teeth would be falling out, and many times they would have almost all of their teeth removed because the radium was breaking up the calcium in their jaw and teeth were falling out. This would lead to then something called radium jar, and one of the problems from radium jar is the bone structures along the jaw would weaken to a point that the jaw itself would fall out of the mouth of the women. Women doing lip pointing, of course, were at higher rates of this because they are taking in so much radium from them through their mouth. The first woman who passed away, this is before really, again, the general populace knew about the dangers, including most doctors. And because of other side effects, you know, all the different types of body aches and everything and the mental things that were going on with her, her death certificate at first stated that she had died of syphilis. Eventually that does change and she is marked of having died of radium poisoning, but that takes years. Lots of years. The founder of USRC, on at least one occasion, as reported by one of the women who worked there, had noticed the girls lip pointing at one point and informed one of the women that she needed to stop doing that because it would make her sick. She did not, unfortunately. So some of the bad business practices that happen at both places. I'm going to first talk about USRC and then I'll talk about Radium Dial because Radium Dial's practices are slightly more infuriating. USRC did at various times try to implement policies that would make it safer for the girls. Both of these policies would ultimately end up getting removed due to cost because radium was expensive. One of the first things was they provided a glass of water for the girls to be able to dip their brushes in order to keep them moist, which would make getting them to that fine, which would also make getting them that fine point easier and keep it out of their mouth as much as possible. But a lot of radium paint and radium would get into this water and it was not, and then that radium would not be able to be collected to be reused. So again, it was not cost effective. The other thing that they ended up trying was using like paper towels where they could use those to try to bring them to that point. And again, it was not something that they were able to easily take that paint back in order to reuse. I say that because, well, you're thinking, well, they're putting them out, they're using it, I mean, it's probably getting on them. USRC, before girls could leave, they would go into a darkened room so they could see, okay, where on your body and clothes have you gotten radium dust? Let's get it all brushed off of you so we can take it, save it, and reuse it. They were very much trying to make sure that things could be reused. They were given a specific amount of radium paint they were able to use and had to make sure that that paint was used just for their dials. If they ran out of paint, well, they weren't going to be able to do any more work for the day, and women were paid by the piece that they did. Also, like I stated, these women were not required to lip point. If they were able to keep that fine point in another way, like if they just they used their fingers and kept it that way, if they spat on it to moisten it rather than putting it directly in their mouth, it was fine. They could do what they needed to do. Radium dial, again, this is the one in Ottawa, Illinois, the girls were required to lip point. They were not allowed to do other types of methods. They were required to have their lunch at the table that they were also painting at. Some of the women may also at times continue to paint while they're also eating. A radium dial also wasn't as concerned about the reuse of the paint. And it is in this location where you would hear of, at the end of the day, the women, because again, the women and girls, because again, as young as 14, and most of them at the oldest were 23. I don't know about you, but I remember when I was that age, hey, this is fun, this is paint, we're being told it's safe, let's just see what it's like painting it on ourselves. So they would paint like their fingernails, or they put like paint on their faces, and because hey, it also let them glow, so it's like, oh, I'm going on a date with someone tonight and I kind of just want to look a little fun and kooky. I'm gonna, just put a little bit of this paint on me. It's just gonna add a little bit like, oh, isn't this neat type thing. And it was perfectly fine for them to do that. So again, at both places, women are getting sick, women are dying. Many of them are having the radium jaw. There's also other sarcomas that are happening. You would get sarcomas sometimes that develop along the chin and jaw area, so you'd have bulging things there. You would have sarcomas forming in the arms and the legs. At least 2 women ended up in back braces because their backs basically broke from the cancers that they were getting. Many women, one leg would all of a sudden slowly become shorter than the other leg as it was being eaten by the radium. And they'd be put in casts to try to make this work. Some of the women, they would try to get pregnant and they would either have a lot of difficulties getting pregnant or they'd have stillbirths. There are, as they found out later, some of the children that they did have also had issues with cancers and other things from the radium poisoning that was going on while their mothers were pregnant. During this, the companies are also trying to, because the women are saying, hey, we're getting sick, this isn't right. So they're having doctors look at them, and partially because they were not tested at first for women. They were not tested at first for radiation poisoning and radiation diseases and death on living bodies. They would have to wait until the body until this person has passed away, and use their bones, typically by burning them and seeing what the radiation was in the ash, to find out if someone had radiation poisoning. So in some cases, the doctors who are looking at them are like, okay, clearly you're sick, but it's not from the paint. We don't know what it is, but it's not from the paint because, yeah, we don't know. Radium safe. We've been telling you, radium safe. And for USRC up in New Jersey, a doctor did eventually come up with an idea using basically the precursor to a Geiger counter to test the radiation coming off of the women's body, and particularly coming out in their breath. And it would be very high rates of radiation that they were able to test off of them. In radium dial, because the stuff was known at this point, doctors that were hired by the company may do that, and they lied and told the girls that they were pictures of health, in fact, healthier than the doctor themselves. I have a lot of issues with Radium Dial and with Ottawa, Illinois itself, because as it was very difficult for the women to find doctors and later lawyers who were willing to go against Radium Dial, because Radium Dial employed so many people of the area, and they did not want to fight their main source of income. It would be kind of like someone, if they were in a small coal mining town, coming down with a coal lung issue and having issues getting a doctor or lawyer to take their case because everyone's connected to the mine. Ultimately, both have cases that go to court, and surprisingly, they also both typically have about 5 women who are the main core bulk of the plaintiffs. And they, on both sides, they do win their cases. They are provided money in support to support them from this. The women from USRC, they do one case, goes well. Later on there's another case or an appeal that happens, also goes really well. But part of the settlement, unfortunately, in that second case, also required that the lawyer who was taking the case no longer participate in trials against USRC. So the second one that they dealt with was unfortunately also the last one that they were able to do anything to get any of the women who worked for USRC money. USRC basically folded relatively soon after that. Radium Dial, the women were having a lot more difficulty because, like I said, they couldn't find a lawyer that could take them. They ended up having to go from Ottawa, Illinois to Chicago, which today would be an hour-and-a-half drive to get there. In the 1920s, it might have taken probably took them a little bit longer to get up there in order to find a lawyer who was willing to take their case. Thankfully for them, not only did they find a lawyer who was willing to take their case, that lawyer took their case pro bono and went through the trial and multiple appeals because the company was trying its darndest to have to wait as long as possible to pay it out in the hopes that the women would die, because if the women died the way the laws were written at that time, they would not have to pay out to the families or next of kin. So most, if not all, of the women who worked at the radium paint areas at USRC or Radium Dial ultimately had radiation poisoning. It was during these trials that radiation poisoning was listed as something that workplaces would be responsible for, because at first it wasn't, and that was part of the problem for these women, to have the companies pay and compensate them for everything that had happened, because it wasn't at first considered part of the workplace, a risk of the workplace. That was something that this changed. A lot of what also changed, a lot of the structures put in place in regards during the atomic testing, during things like the Manhattan Projects and all of the other types of radiation, nuclear energy, anything regarding radiation and safety regarding radiation work came because of what these women went through. Some, it's less certain whether or not they may have gotten any issues with radiation sickness or radiation poisoning. I say that because there were some people who may have worked at either USRC or Radium Dial for a week at the most. So they may not have gotten a lot into their system that, yes, they would have ultimately died at some point, and they also would have ultimately gotten radiation sickness at some point, because it would have the half-life of radium is so long that it would have eventually caused issues, but that may not have been what killed them. They may not have ever reached a high enough threshold for that to be problematic. Also, some of the women, they were able to live who worked even for a while, were able to live for a decent number of times because they were lucky enough that where the radiation was really deciding to put itself were things like their arms or their legs and not their jaw. Because hey, you have this massive sarcoma, this massive issue in your arm or your leg that's your main source of your radiation poisoning. Okay, let's just remove it. A lot of people some of these women that survived for longer than others survived because they had arms and legs amputated. Well, after the court cases were done, they did various tests throughout time, just trying to keep an eye on the women, keep an eye on how bad things were. And again, like I said, a lot of this information that they ended up getting was then used to create better work practices and workplace policies in regards to things that dealt with radioactive material. The end of the book, and when I say the end of the book, I mean the end of the book. We're at the postscript, and all of this is notes and references and all of that. So when I say the end of the book, I mean the end of the book. It made me actually throw the book onto the table. I wasn't going to actively throw it across because what I read pissed me off so much. Because what I read was taking place then in the 70s by one of the splinter companies. So Radium Dial, the heads of it had a little bit of a disagreement on how to make things go. So you had Radium Dial, and then someone went and decided to make his own company called Luminous Processes. Luminous Processes in the 70s had their own suits against them regarding radiation poisoning, and their argument was, well, you can't hold us accountable. You also have to hold the workers accountable because they're the ones that are doing these things. We don't tell them that they have to be doing it. The problem is that Luminous Processing did not have anywhere in training, in signage, in anything warning their workers that they were dealing with radioactive materials and the dangers of handling radioactive materials. Again, this is well after all of the things that happened to the women in this book. This is well after we've established protocols because we had to use them during the things like the Manhattan Project. And they went into this. Sorry, I know I got a little yelly there. Again, I threw the book when I read that. So, that is your history aspect of the Radium Girls. So now I'm going to actually talk about the writing and the book itself. So in the middle of the book, because a lot of times you'll find this with your historical books, you have pictures. So you have pictures of the women before working at either the USRC or Radium Dial. You have pictures of them during their time working there. And then you have pictures after. So you have pictures of sarcomas. You have pictures of the jaw. You have pictures displaying what lip pointing was and as the women were dying. One of the things that can be very difficult when writing about history is you don't want it to be like a history book, a history textbook. Not if you're actually wanting people outside of history students to want to read it. So you have to walk that line of telling the history, but telling it in a way similar to how you would see people writing in a fiction novel. And I feel Kate Moore did a really good job with that. There's a lot of focus on the events and the facts of the cases, but there's also a lot of information focusing on the people. Not just the women, but even focusing on the people who worked at USRC, who worked at Radium Dial, the doctors, the lawyers, all of these people to give it more depth, give it more feeling and emotion. This book took me longer to read. It was not one that I was easily being like, hey, I'm just going to crank through this. I don't think that's because it's a history book. I think it's because of the subject matter that it's dealing with. I was only able to take it in small servings because I got so mad at what these women were going through. And I'm also very glad that when I have my time schedule that I do my reading, it's far enough away from either my lunch or dinner because it's more descriptive on the medical gore and the medical aspects that what I stated in regards with like the jars. Even if you don't read this book, and there's multiple books out there regarding the time frame of the Radium Girls. I've not read them, so I can't compare this one to those. Even if you don't read this book, and I'm going to say I give this book a good 8 out of 10. I didn't go into all the depth and all the details regarding the Radium Girls and what they went through. I gave you guys a quick overview in regards to it. Even if you don't read this book or don't read something regarding it, learn about what these women went through. Learn about what these companies did to them. It's important to know this history. It's something that could have been easily been like, hey, yeah, so these women are dying. Whatever, doesn't matter. It could have been easy even after the cases were done to be like, all right, so we did this, we ran out of some money, but we don't really have to change anything. I mean, even these days, you still hear cases. You still hear about times in which workplaces don't have the best safety for people that work for them. So, learn about this. It's a dark part of our history, and not as dark as, say, things like lynchings or anything like that, but those dark parts of history are important to learn about. And again, looking things up online, going through just, typical history books and textbooks and whatnot, it's harder to really get into what you're learning. A historical novel, not a historical fiction novel, just a historical novel, can take that history that it's so important to learn about and put it in a way that is more palatable. And in regards to pretty much any type of historical topic, especially the more dystopian historical topics, consuming them in a concept like the Radium Girls as opposed to just the facts and the dates and the events is a way to learn about it without feeling bored or forced, which I think will then make it a little bit easier to remember. So yeah, that was Kate Moore's The Radium Girls. I'm sorry that it was a very sad and depressing topic. Most of the books I read aren't in that category, so yeah, things like this will happen every now and then, but it's not going to be the main bulk of this, but I still highly recommend that you watch any videos that fall into this category. And I do highly recommend reading the books. So again, like the video, subscribe to my channel, hit the bell so you get those notifications, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, and bye.